John Bride awoke to a tumultuous crash as he tumbled out of his bunk and onto the floor. The floor took a sharp list, and he instantly knew the ship had struck something, or, heaven forbid, had been struck. The vessel the U.S. Navy sailor was on was a patrol vessel guarding the coast of Alaska, watching for any sign of a second invasion by the Imperial forces of Japan like the one that had occurred in 1942. The vessel itself was the USS YP-73, a former civilian vessel purchased by the United States Navy to serve as an auxiliary patrol vessel in the Alaskan sector. On her bow was proudly stamped her number. Her patrol route since 1940 was the Athelian Patrol. It was a minor role to play in 1945, given how the tide in the Pacific had definitively turned against Japan, but was still important. The YP-73 herself was a converted fishing vessel that was launched in 1937. She was just over 84 feet long, had a beam of 20 feet, and her weight was 115 gross registered tons. There was a forward structure on her bow, but most of the outer superstructure, including her wheelhouse built on a second story, was closer to the stern of the ship. She'd been manned by a crew of 16 sailors when her patrols had started, but when John Bride and William Phillips were transferred to her a few years after her patrols began, the crew had ballooned to 18. It had been a major adjustment to go from the warm weather of the eastern coast of the United States, ready to ship to the Atlantic Ocean, to overnight be sent to the icy coast of the Alaska Territory. At least it was important work, but not exciting. A lot of watching, but no U-boats to sink. It seemed that neither of the two later arrivals to the vessel would be buying the other a drink for sinking the most U-boats like they had planned when they were still expecting to serve in the Atlantic. The watchful days had been uneventful until the moment of the sudden crash, and the YP-73 had been a good ship to serve on at the very least. And now, that boat was filling with frigid polar ocean water. Bride didn't know what had happened, but the list the ship was quickly gaining was telling enough that she was taking on water and likely going down. For all he knew, they'd been attacked by a surprise offensive by the retreating Japanese. A desperate last attempt to break out of the defensive war they'd been enduring since the Battle of Midway and turn the tide on the Americans again. Bride attempted to get to his feet as the ship creaked below and around him, and then she shook, and he again was knocked back to the floor. In reality, the cause of the crash wasn't the Japanese. It was January 15th, 1945. And the patrol vessel had struck an underwater reef 1,000 yards off Kodiak Island, east of the Spruce Cape signal station. At first, she grounded herself on the reef, but when the ship shook the second time, it was because she'd been washed free from the reef she'd struck, and the ship was now sinking into a frigid, watery grave. Bride scrambled to his feet, the only one in the room at the time of the crash, and hurried out of the cramped quarters into the passage outside. The wood was creaking, and the ship had momentarily settled at what had to be a 10-degree list to port, and he made for the stairs to the top deck, but stopped at the base of them. Looking over his shoulder, Bride stared back down the passage toward the other doorways that led to the rest of the quarters. "William!" he shouted, but heard no answer, and Bride found himself at a crossroads. He didn't know if his friend was back there or out on deck with everyone else. But the sight of green, foamy water gushing into the end of the passageway prompted his movement. He sprinted over the slanting floor, towards the flooding, to the room where his best friend William Phillips's bunk was, and found that his gut had been right. The water was licking around the door frame hungrily, mercilessly, when he made it inside and found Phillips. Phillips hadn't been up top when the crash occurred. He'd been doing what Bride had been, sleeping after their shift, and his bunk had toppled over on top of him when the ship was jostled. Phillips was on his back underneath the toppled bed, trying to push the heavy frame off, which was pressing down on his chest. His face had turned red from both the strain and inability to breathe. "Shit!" Bride gasped. He threw himself into the room, grasping the metal bed frame and lifting. Phillips had been pushing on it, gasping as the weight pressed into his chest, preventing him from yelling for help, but he couldn't move it alone. The water was beginning to slop into the room, running down past the two as Bride lifted, with Phillips pushing at the same time. With a grunt from the effort, Bride lifted the bunk enough for Phillips to slide out. He dropped it again and grasped his best friend by the shoulders. "Are you hurt?" Hey, are you hurt? Bride asked. Phillips was sucking in multiple deep breaths but shook his head. I'm not hurt, he replied. Before either could speak again, a wave of frigid ocean water gushed into the doorway as the passageway outside flooded. The wave sloshed into the room and drenched their backs. The room was beginning to fill, and the slant of the floor was getting steeper as the patrol vessel settled forward by the bow, still listing to her port side as well. Shit, come on, Bride urged, grabbing Phillips's hand and pulling him to his feet. But Phillips's leg gave out as he tried to stand, and he collapsed back into the water. What? Bride exclaimed. Then he spotted that Phillips was indeed hurt. His leg had a bloody wound by the ankle. Damn it, Bride said, as the water hungrily gushed around his feet. Okay, come on, he said, grabbing Phillips under the shoulders and lifting him up, pulling his friend's left arm over his shoulder to help Phillips get his feet under himself. As the water continued flooding into the room, rising fast, they waded through the knee-deep water and out into the passageway as the floor began to take a more severe list to the side. A sudden shudder from the ship nearly threw the two from their feet as they waded into the passageway and towards the staircase out. With the water following them like a starved, relentless predator, they waded through the freezing seawater and to the stairs that led on deck. The patrol boat shuddered again as they reached the stairs, and this time they both lost their footing for a moment. Phillips slipped out of Bride's grasp slightly as he landed on his bleeding leg. Come on, Bride shouted, forcefully pulling Phillips back onto his feet and half carrying him over his shoulder up onto deck as the water reached the stairs, consuming the ship eagerly as a hungry snake would consume a mouse. The room Phillips had been in was already submerged by the time they reached the top of the stairs. Neither knew what had happened, but it was obvious that an open hole had been torn into the ship's wooden hull by the source of the crash. Due to how fast the ship was flooding, the damage was definitely significant. Unlike when a body was injured and blood gushed out, when a ship was injured, the water gushed in. A ship didn't have to bleed out to die, and the patrol ship was dying fast in the icy Gulf of Alaska. Outside, the cold Alaskan air was whipping by and felt just as frigid to the skin as the water flooding the USS YP-73 did. The sky was pitch dark, not a star visible in the sky, and the ocean around the sinking vessel was just as black as the night sky was. But the violent whitecaps were visible in the dark void surrounding the ship, and they didn't look the least bit inviting. As the two got out onto the top deck, they both saw most of the 16 other crew members rushing around as their ship slowly sank into the sea. Some ran inside the upper superstructure, someone was still on the bridge on the second story of the aft superstructure. Meanwhile, others were coming down from the wheelhouse. Someone was standing inside the main cabin at the end of the ship and shouting through an open window at someone else who was on deck, and others still were making the life rafts ready. They'd already gotten them down from the railing of the upper structure, where they typically hung, and down onto the deck. Amid the calamity, the wind was howling, and icy flakes were falling from the sky, thick like rain in a monsoon. The water swallowing the ship looked rough, unfriendly, and unforgiving. And both Phillips and Bride knew it was utterly cold. Colder than anything they could imagine, even after being briefly half dunked in it below deck. Being totally submerged in it, or swimming in it, would be completely different. Urging Phillips forward, Bride hobbled towards a fellow crew member who was rushing towards the stern of the patrol vessel. Bride grabbed him by the collar. Hey, what happened? Was it the Japanese? He asked. The crew member shook his head distractedly. We struck a reef, he explained. We grounded it first, but she's drifted off it and we're going down, he added, shoving himself free and hurrying towards the stern. Phillips and Bride watched the sailor hurry by and vanish around the side of the former fishing vessel's superstructure. Another looked down into the staircase Phillips and Bride had just come up, immediately stopped, and rushed toward the stern as well. If he was planning to go below for anything, his path had been blocked by the rising water. The vessel was also creaking and cracking now. Even on the top deck, it wouldn't take long for the water to reach them. Everyone was hurrying to prepare an abandoned ship. Oh, shit, Bride heard Phillips say. He turned and saw the water was beginning to gush up over the port side of the bow as the patrol vessel began to go down. As she did, She began to right herself back onto an even keel, but that wouldn't save her. Bride gulped as he saw the water washing towards them on the deck. No amount of training prepared anyone to be on a sinking ship, let alone one sinking into icy ocean water. He tightened his grasp on the arm Phillips had over his shoulder. "Come on. We have to find you a life jacket," he said, turning and moving with Phillips towards the stern. "What about you?" Phillips asked as he hobbled along with Bride. Bride didn't look at him. "You first," he said, amid the strain of half-carrying his friend. The ship lurched and began to slip down faster, the water chasing the two up the deck just as it had been doing in the ship's interior. The forward structure on the bow was surrounded by water already, and the forward deck was completely submerged. They headed around the superstructure towards the stern and saw everyone else climbing onto the side, jumping from the ship and into the water. The life rafts had already been thrown overboard. There was no time to properly launch them. "Do you think they sent a distress call?" Phillips asked, the cold air biting into his unprotected skin. "I don't know. We don't have time to worry about it, though," Bride replied, grunting from half-carrying Phillips along the entire deck. The deck suddenly slanted, and the ship shook, and the wood groaned like she was screaming in pain. With that, she began to drop like a rock thrown into a body of water. The motion nearly threw Phillips and Bride from their feet. They could feel the ship sinking lower below them. The YP-73 was going down fast now. "Shit, jump!" Bride said, knowing they didn't have time to find life jackets. The two sailors threw themselves over the side and into the icy ocean. Bride surfaced first, gasping so loud it was practically a scream from the shock of the cold water. It felt like what he'd imagined being shot everywhere at once by white-hot bullets would feel like. He quickly collected himself, breathing deeply, and pulled a struggling Phillips up to the surface after he again grabbed him under his shoulder. Phillips let out a similar gasp of pain to Bride's as his head breached through the surface of the water. Meanwhile, the YP-73 shuddered and groaned again. Her stern rose up out of the sea and into the air as she filled with water. Her stern rose high up, and she settled for a moment. Then, with air gushing out like a geyser as water filled her, she went down. Slow at first, but then the plunge picked up speed. It was one long, smooth slide, and then she was gone with a final splash as what air was left inside her escaped. And Bride, Phillips, and the 16 other sailors who had been on the patrol vessel were left stranded in the freezing, icy, rough water in total darkness. A large wave washed over them. Bride spat out a mouthful of seawater and again pulled Phillips back to the surface. With his leg injury, Phillips was finding it hard to tread water. Their heavy clothing didn't help either. Both had been so exhausted that they'd collapsed into their respective bunks in all their clothing. "Hold on to me," Bride said. "No, I'll wear you out faster. It already won't take long in this water," Phillips protested. "I don't care. You're not drowning here for me," Bride argued, not letting Phillips pull himself free. "You got me out of the ship. Now focus on yourself. I'll be fine," Phillips assured, trying to pull himself free, not wanting to drown his best friend with him. "You can't swim with that hurt leg," Bride retorted, grasping Phillips by the arm and pulling him back to him so they wouldn't be separated. Before either could say more, a large piece of broken-off wood splashed to the surface next to them, followed by other pieces of timber from the ship that had torn free from her as she went down. They swam to the nearest one and clung onto it. It was buoyant enough to hold them both just at the surface with their arms wrapped around it. Bride put his arm over Phillips's shoulders and grasped the board on the other side to make sure he stayed on it. They could hear the other sailors shouting nearby amid the howling wind and splashing mountainous waves, but they couldn't see them. Bride noticed ice was already forming in his hair. "Well," he said, shivering from the cold to the point his voice began to develop a stutter, "at least there are no sharks around here." Phillips just groaned. "I thought I was the one who made the jokes," he said, shivering even worse than Bride was. "Well, You've been slacking off lately, so someone had to do it, Bride responded. He looked around as the shouting continued. Do, do, do you think the the others got into the life rafts? He asked. I don't care what the others are on at the moment, Phillips replied in a shaking voice. I care about the fact that we're not. Bride nodded. He knew they wouldn't last long in the frigid water. And now that the initial incident was over, the two truly noticed the cold. They noticed how much they were shivering, how much they both hurt, but that they also couldn't feel anything. There was simultaneously numbness and excruciating pain coursing through every sense the two had. Even breathing felt both frigid and painful. But at the same time, the cold made it short and rapid, only adding to the agony. Each breath felt like a stab with a knife. Bride groaned as the waves sloshed around them. He never expected to find himself in such a situation. Sure, he knew being on a sinking ship was a possibility, but never here, off the coast of Alaska, in freezing water that was too cold for words to even describe. It wasn't fair because he and Phillips weren't even supposed to be there. After the secret experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in 1943 had gone wrong and resulted in a massive death toll that had to be explained as accidental in letters to the families, Phillips and Bride had both hoped they would be able to put it all behind them once they were out in the Atlantic and distracted by the ongoing war for control of it. They'd both hoped they'd be so busy that the experiment would be driven from their minds. But instead, right before they'd been due to ship out to the Atlantic in 1943, they'd been unexpectedly shipped elsewhere at the last possible minute. Not to the Pacific Theater or anything like that, but to the most out-of-the-way place possible that they could serve in instead. Instead of the Atlantic Ocean, the two sailors had found themselves as part of the auxiliary patrols along the coast of Alaska. Transferred, Bride had said when their former captain told them. What do you mean, transferred? We were due to sail to the Atlantic tomorrow. Paisley, their former captain, had just shrugged. It's not up to me, he said, holding up two papers in his hands and dropping them down on a table. These orders come straight from the top. Tomorrow, you transfer to the Alaskan patrol. They knew it wasn't a coincidence. He wanted them somewhere out of the way, somewhere that they wouldn't be a problem, somewhere he wouldn't have to worry as much about them blabbing about the experiment, and where people couldn't ask them about rumors that might have been going around. Aaronmore, who had nearly gotten them killed by sending them on to the USS Eldridge after the experiment to turn her invisible had gone horribly wrong and driven many of the crew into an uncontrollable homicidal rage, one side effect among the many other equally horrific afflictions caused by the experiment, including being frozen in place, becoming fused into the metal structure of the ship, complete loss of sanity, horrific physical mutations, and more. It was an experiment Aaronmore was observing on behalf of the entire United States Naval Command. After it was clear something had gone wrong on the ship the experiment was conducted on, he'd sent specifically Phillips and Bride on board because they had brothers on board the ship, who both had simply vanished and were never located. There was never any explanation. Every other crew member was eventually accounted for, save for Blake Bride and Tom Phillips. No traces of them were ever found. The grief of the unexplainable loss was something the two hoped to put behind them, as good soldiers did once out in the Atlantic, but the grueling Alaskan coast and constant patrols had been enough to eventually drive it from their minds. It was the one good thing about their new positions keeping them busy. But the pain of the loss never fully went away. In fact, even in the cold water, they could still feel it deep inside them. Aaronmore had wanted them here, out of the way, somewhere insignificant, a spot no one would remember when it came to history. He wanted them silenced or put somewhere they couldn't talk to many people. As one of the highest ranked individuals in the entire United States Navy, Aaron Moore had the power to pull such strings, to get last minute transfers, to sweep things under the rug, to oversee such a highly secretive experiment and then cover it up once the outcome was not what had been desired. As they continued to float in the ocean, aware that the other sailors of the YP-73 were slowly falling silent around them, both Phillips and Bride knew hypothermia would set in quickly in such cold water, and then that'd be it. As they clung to the wood, being battered by the waves and wind and falling snow and ice, they stopped talking and focused on trying to stay awake. But as fate would have it, it seemed the two weren't doomed to die in the cold ocean. By the time both knew they wouldn't have been able to hang on for much longer, another ship arrived. It was the Coast Guard cutter Bittersweet. It seemed the YP-73 had indeed sent a distress call before she went down. Over the next few minutes, the Bittersweet plucked Phillips, Bride, and 6 other survivors from the water. The Bittersweet sailors seemed shocked when they realized Phillips and Bride were still alive. Everyone else they'd rescued had climbed out of the water and onto the rafts. No one else who grabbed onto any of the debris were still alive. The other 10 who had been on the YP-73 had all died from the extreme cold by the time the rescue ship arrived. The survivors were hurried inside to get warm, and the Bittersweet quickly had turned around and taken them all back to port for medical attention. Among those who were deceased, Bride noted by the simple fact he wasn't on the rescue ship, as a blanket was thrown over his own shoulders and a warm drink shoved into his numb hands, was the young sailor who had informed them that the patrol vessel had struck a reef and wasn't bombed by the Japanese. Aside from Phillips and Bride, those who had survived included 3 officers and 3 enlisted men. Those who had died were 1 officer and 9 other enlisted men. By the last week of March, both John Bride and William Phillips had nearly regained their full strength and recovered from the ordeal. They had spent the previous roughly 2 months in a medical center on Kodiak Island. It was a good place to recover, all things considered, very well defended, even though the failed Japanese invasion of Alaska had not advanced to any point near the island. But the defenses were reassuring when in a vulnerable state. The town had been turned into a fortress due to fears of a Japanese invasion following the attack on Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese invasion in the Aleutian Islands had remained much further to the west of Kodiak and had ended by 1943. Patrol vessels like the now foundered YP-73 were watching to ensure another one did not happen, even though the Japanese were retreating on all fronts across the Pacific. Following the sinking and rescue from the ocean, Phillips and Bride both had not only developed hypothermia in the incident, but they also had spent the last few months suffering from long-term illness from it and other effects brought on by the freezing water. Their hypothermia had been severe, both were lucky to have survived. Both had experienced frostbite to varying degrees of severity, but nothing bad enough to result in any loss of digits or limbs, as well as inflammation in various parts of the body, fluid in the lungs, and a weakness in their whole bodies, resulting in shaking limbs and unsteady walking. That they had not been able to fully shake off yet, though their strength was returning. Thankfully, for them, the worst of the effects seemed to be past, and they were now well on the mend. It had been a hard battle, but it was nearly over now. But they weren't fully recovered yet. They still became winded easily, felt weak, and were told that they needed bed rest for an undetermined amount of time yet. They both knew they just needed more time and were working to encourage the other, but Bride had noticed something off about Phillips in the long months of sitting side by side in one room. In fact, something had been off about him since the Philadelphia experiment. His personality had never been the same after that traumatic day, and in the few months since the sinking, it had only become more apparent. Phillips hadn't told Bride any of his true feelings, but ever since the experiment on the USS Eldridge, Phillips had dealt with a lot of self-doubt. and Bride saving him from going down with the YP-73 had only dredged them back up to the surface with full force. On the Eldridge, Phillips had effectively thrown another sailor to the figurative rabid wolves. He'd done so in order to save his own skin. Ever since then, he'd been eaten away at inside by self-doubt about if he could be relied on or if he'd abandon anyone in a life-threatening situation. Bride had gone back inside of a sinking ship to save him, and Phillips wished he knew for certain he could do the same, but effectively killing another sailor to save his own life had left him with the feeling that he couldn't, and that he'd always choose to save his own skin when it came down to it. Phillips wished he could convince himself otherwise, that he would be there when someone needed him, but he just found he couldn't. Even if it was his best friend he had to go back for, that little feeling of doubt was there, chastising him over if he could or not, and he didn't see it going away anytime soon, and it made him angry. Lying on 2 beds in a shared room, they had originally been accompanied by some of the other YP-73 survivors, but they'd all been discharged by the time their vessel was stricken from the naval record a month after the sinking. Since then, they'd been on their own. Phillips and Bride seemed to be the only two suffering from a slow recovery and long-term illness from the experience. The days just seemed to pass and not much seemed to change. Though for them little seemed to change, things on the wider scale were far from stagnant. As Phillips and Bride spent months recovering from severe hypothermia, the wars in Europe and the Pacific were continuing to rage on, but the tide noticeably had turned, seeming definitively, to the Allies' favor on both fronts. The Germans and Japanese were both retreating, and Italy had long since surrendered to the Allies. With any luck, the two thought, the war would be over by the time they were finally discharged from the hospital. Then, they could get on with their lives. Every time the radio broadcasted a news report, the two listened. "How are we today?" a nurse asked, bringing the two coffee as another morning began, as mundane as all the others had been. "Better than yesterday," Bride said, taking his mug with a polite smile. She smiled back. Bride had a feeling she fancied him. Phillips coughed and took his mug with a silent nod of thanks. He pulled his blanket up higher around his shoulders and took a sip. "Maybe we'll get you two up for a long walk around the facility today," the nurse encouraged. "That'd be great," Bride agreed. A soldier then entered the room, his uniform crisp and neat, adorned with medals, and waited by the door. The nurse sighed. She tucked her tray under her arm when the soldier walked in, looking displeased, but said, "You have a visitor waiting for you. When you think you can stand to be on your feet for a while, this young man will show you to him. Excuse me." She left the room, but the young soldier standing by the door remained. He was a Marine and remained silent as Phillips and Bride cast confused glances in his direction. "Visitor?" Bride eventually asked. Phillips shrugged but didn't speak. After drinking their coffee, the warm liquid did them good. Phillips and Bride dressed themselves in clean white uniforms that Navy sailors wore and followed the young but well-ranked Marine out of the room. They didn't speak and simply followed him. The soldier escorting them eventually stopped at an open doorway to a conference-looking room and stood respectfully aside, allowing them to enter. They did so. The room had no windows, and the walls were painted gray. The two sailors entered the room and stopped just inside the doorway, at the sight of a familiar figure waiting at the table in the center of the room. Standing there, leaning against it, was Ernest Joseph Aaronmore. There he was, like a specter, who appeared the moment the two had most of their strength back to sap it all away again. Both stopped as if they'd been struck as soon as they saw him. The soldier who had guided Phillips and Bride to the room left the door open. Perhaps Aaronmore felt he'd need someone to rush in if the two lashed out at seeing him again for the first time since 1943. "Hello again," Aaronmore greeted as if there was no history between them. Or perhaps he merely felt untouchable and didn't feel the need to worry about such things. His attitude seemed to suggest the latter. "The fuck do you want?" Phillips asked, foregoing any of the formality he'd had in their first meeting in 1943. "Good to see you're recovering well. I heard about the sinking of the YP-73 and personally read about each of the sailors on board to see who had survived and who died. And you were disappointed to see we were still alive, weren't you? Phillips snapped. A slight smile spread on Aaron Moore's face at the comment, but he changed the subject. Come in. I came all this way just to see you two in particular. There are things at play we need to discuss. He motioned to the table behind him, where a map was laid out. Phillips and Bride didn't move. It's time sensitive, gentlemen, Aaron Moore firmly prompted. Slowly, Phillips and Bride walked into the room and stood on the opposite side of the table from Aaron Moore. Sorry if we're a little cautious. Last time we took direct orders from you, we ended up on a ship of horrors and our brothers missing in action, Phillips retorted, clearly agitated. Bride was silent and, after a moment, Aaron Moore spoke again. He didn't acknowledge Phillips, but instead got straight to the point. You two are aware, yes, that the Nazis have been looting priceless works of art, historical artifacts, and other prizes from museums in every country they've trampled over since they stupidly wandered into Poland. Priceless works of art, pieces of history, important artifacts, all stolen by those smug madmen. Well, now that they're treating with their tails tucked between their legs, it seems they want to make a last effort to escape with as much of it as possible. Or perhaps just ensure we don't get what they've stolen back. If they can't have it, no one can. Barbarian mentality. Plus, some might have grandiose visions that Nazi Germany will rise again, and if it does, then they would have to have treasures on hand to finance another war. He paused, and Phillips and Bride both remained silent, which prompted Aaron Moore to continue his briefing. Our intelligence indicates the Nazis intend to take these treasures and a slew of other items of varying significance and place them on a train currently traveling through regions of Poland still under German control. With them on the losing end of the war, they're going to try to make a run for it with all these treasures stashed on that train to an unknown location. It is a direct and desperate response to the Western Allied invasion of Germany. We entered Germany on the 22nd. We received the intelligence of this contingency plan on the 23rd. Unfortunately, we haven't broken the exact code they used for the message. It's a more complex variant of one we already have, so we only understand one word in 3. So what we know is fragmentary. Aaron Moore paused for a breath and indicated to the map laid out on the table. It was a map of Poland, with railroads highlighted. We don't know where the train is. We don't know where it's going. We just know it's traveling right now through German-controlled territory in Poland, which is everywhere past the black line going down the map here, he said, pointing. It's gathering up whatever is brought to it at each town or station it stops at. Art, military secrets, who knows what else. Perhaps even Hitler's personal treasures. All we have are maps like this for cross-reference, but we believe the train is traveling on an unmapped or partially unmapped rail system that runs somewhere through southern Poland. A railroad constructed by the Nazis after their invasion in 1939, possibly ending somewhere in the Central Sudets, at an unmapped mine tunnel, or even an old one perhaps, or one of their many tunnels or bunkers that are all over Europe. Either way, if the train escapes with these items on board, it will likely be buried and all but impossible to find. The Nazis are nothing if not thorough in their losing. They choose to do this action specifically when losing the war instead of diverting manpower and resources anywhere, only to keep those items away from us. Due to the historical significance of the artifacts in consideration, and of the military interest in some of the other items that are likely being taken on the train, we cannot let that happen. Aaron Moore explained, like he was briefing soldiers he was about to send into battle. It was a tone Phillips and Bride both did not like hearing. It was just like the one he'd had before sending them on to the USS Eldridge. They also did not like where the conversation seemed to be going. Last time they had a brief like this from Aaron Moore was also right before he'd sent them on to the USS Eldridge. So we come to it now. We are sending you two, just you two, behind enemy lines. Your objective is simple. Find and stop the train at all costs, Aaron Moore finished. Are you mad? That's the heart of German-controlled territory. We'd have better odds parachuting into Iwo Jima and hiking to where our boys currently are without any weapons than we would walking into Poland right now, where none of our boys are, Phillips all but shouted. Why would you possibly send us to do this instead of some special operations team, like the Army Rangers or something? Bride asked, shaking his head, not believing what he was hearing. Hell, drop an airborne division into southern Poland and secure the rail lines. Don't have us walk in there and expect anything to get done. Poland is crawling with the Germans right now. There's probably a gun behind every bush and a tank hidden in every barn. Why do you think we can do this? He couldn't believe they were being dragged helplessly back into another of Aaron Moore's games. I watched things carefully, and in the experiment, he said the word carefully, as if not wishing to admit it ever actually had happened out loud. I saw that you both were quick on your feet, had fast reactions to change in a situation, and good at thinking your next moves through in a tough situation. I heard your reports on everything that happened inside the ship and the choices you made to escape, Airmore replied matter-of-factly. I feel confident you can pull this task off. Do we even look like we know how a train works? Bride blurted out. I feel confident you can figure it out, Aaron curtly responded. Fuck you, and fuck your feelings, Philip said. And fuck all your medals. How many people did you put into their graves to earn those? Is each medal pinned on that uniform a dead man? Are 2 of them for Tom and Blake? He added, pointing at the medals hanging on Aaron Moore's uniform. He was barely restraining himself by the time he was done. A year and a half of held-in rage was threatening to burst out like water from a failing dam. Aaron Moore did not react to the insult. His bushy mustache didn't even twitch. We're not trained for this. We're Navy sailors, not ground infantry, Bride added. You'll sail to Europe before the end of the week. You'll be at the front line in 7 days at most. You'll be given a more detailed brief before you set out, given all the information about where the train should be that we have available. You'll be outfitted in standard infantryman uniforms. You'll be provided weapons, ammunition, grenades, food, water, a few little treats for the road, a compass, and a map like this one, Aaron Moore said, lifting the corner of the map up off the table for a moment. I'd recommend trying to find a German map of rail lines and compare them. Some soldier might have one, or some abandoned camp might. You might also find one in a town along the railroad. Use one if you find it, and look for discrepancies or rail lines that don't appear on our maps. Either at all, or merge off lines that do appear on ours. Find the train, Aaron Moore finished. Phillips exhaled hard through his nose. And board it like cowboys holding up a train in the Old West, he said, fed up already with the whole thing. And hold it until the Allied line reaches you. At no point should they be any more than a few hours behind you. The Germans are retreating, so progress is fast, Aaron Moore repeated. In summary, your mission is to stop the train so the approaching Allied forces following you can secure it, along with all the gold, artifacts, and everything else on board it. As I said, they'll only be a few hours behind you. If you can find the train, stop it, and secure it, you should have no further trouble. As I also said, the Nazis are retreating fast and won't have time to go back and look for it once they realize it's overdue. While traveling, keep hidden when possible. Expect traps, ambush zones, radical fanatics who might do who knows what now that they're losing. Don't let scout planes see you. The last thing we need is the Nazis increasing their defenses just before our troops arrive in the area. Don't trust any beggar on the road. Don't trust any closed door in any building. You see a tank that's abandoned, you chuck a grenade inside just to be sure. Don't trust anyone or anything until our boys catch up to you. Phillips snorted, noting an all too familiar twinkle in Aaron Moore's eyes. He put his poker face back on. He didn't believe a word of what he was hearing out of the man's mouth. Aaron Moore wasn't this stupid, he knew, to send them to do this if it was something he truly wanted accomplished. He had other motives for sending them to Poland, and Phillips knew what they were already. Hell, he knew it wasn't a coincidence that he had turned up now, after they'd narrowly survived one catastrophe and were still recovering from it. He knew it wasn't a coincidence Aaron Moore turned up when he and Bride were still standing on shaking legs, with weakness in their arms and shortness of breath after too much exertion. "Are there any questions?" Aaron Moore asked. Neither Phillips nor Bride spoke. They knew from before that they were helpless to stop something Aaron Moore had put into play. The amount of strings he had to have pulled to get this insane mission approved must have been more than there were sailors on the USS Eldridge when all hell broke loose on her in 1943. Aaron Moore nodded and now smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Neither was the sparkle in his eyes. "Good. You are dismissed." As Phillips and Bride left the room, Phillips turned to Bride as they walked down the hall back to their room. "You see that look in his eyes? He wants us to fucking die on this mission." Bride nodded. "Of course he does," he replied. "Why do you think he's sending us into the heart of German-controlled territory? We survived the sinking, and that put us back on his radar, got him thinking about us again, and what we know. So he wants to try to have us silenced in a way that won't raise eyebrows before the war ends. And here's his opportunity. If we die in Poland, we're just two nobodies killed in action. Nothing suspicious. And no chance we'll ever talk about everything we saw happen because of the experiment," Phillips finished, shaking his head in anger. It was just like the USS Eldridge, though. They knew they had no choice but to go along with Aaron Moore's game. And this time, they would have no flares to get them out of danger. It was in the first week of April when Phillips and Bride found themselves outfitted in infantry uniforms, helmets sitting loosely on their heads, holding rifles just like the ones they'd been given when they were sent aboard the Eldridge, and making their way across the countryside of Poland. They couldn't help but feel strange wearing army attire and not Navy uniforms. They also felt weird about being on the ground in the middle of a war. It was something completely alien to them and unlike anything they were trained for. They'd been trained to fight out on the ocean, on ships and sink U-boats, not be on the ground and possibly engage with enemy ground troops. As they made their way through the countryside, they hadn't seen anything, save distant farmhouses. Some still having livestock in the surrounding fields, others seemed empty and abandoned. They were now well beyond the line of Allied-controlled areas, far from any towns, and deep in southwestern Poland. It was territory still being held by the Nazis. The sky had also been overcast and gray since they arrived. Where the train was supposed to be, they had no idea. It was like chasing a ghost. They hadn't even seen so much as a rail line since they'd hiked out past the line and into enemy territory days earlier. The Allied line was ever expanding, though. Explosions sounding in the distance almost constantly told the two that they weren't too far behind them, just too far back to be of any help in case things became dicey. They'd been walking through Poland for days, sleeping in shifts at night, but now could see something promising. Far ahead on the horizon was the hazy outline of the mountain range where the train was supposed to be heading to. It was much further into German-controlled territory than they were now, in territory the Allies were nowhere near to claiming yet. The Germans might have been retreating, but their grasp over Poland was still as strong as it had been since 1933 when they invaded. This deep in enemy territory, Phillips and Bride both knew that there could be a gun aimed at them from any distant window or from behind every tree they passed. Cross-checking their map with their estimated position, they knew miles ahead would be a road that led to one, if not the last, town or village the train would likely be passing through, according to the information they'd been given before setting off for Europe. It was a town with a name neither could pronounce, but they felt confident they could find their way there at the least. It was based on shaky intelligence at best, but it was better than nothing. The road that led there was miles ahead still, on the other side of the hills they had come to. When they reached the road, they'd have to head to the left to reach the town, which was several miles further away from the spot they'd come to when they reached the road. Their progress also wasn't as fast as either would have liked. There were still times when their legs became weak, when their arms shook, when they had shortness of breath. They were still not fully recovered from sinking into frigid ocean water for an extended amount of time. Definitely not to the point of doing any kind of physical activity that they were now, but they had no choice but to carry on, pausing for breaks as needed. They knew it wasn't a coincidence Aaron Moore had sent them when he did. They were more vulnerable in their current state. Step, 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 one after the other, with no known destination. It was enough to drive a man mad. Their water was gone by the time they began traveling through the hills towards the distant road. The last stream they'd come to had not been in a state that allowed them to refill their canteens. The stream had been filled with the corpses of cattle, riddled with bullet holes, along with the bodies of what seemed to be every man, woman, and child from an entire small village, bloating and lining the banks or caught in the stream itself. It seemed the Nazis had leveled an entire village and executed all the inhabitants while they retreated. For no reason other than just because they could. And the water had obviously been poisoned by the number of bodies lying in it, so the two had carried on after taking a moment to fully take in what they'd seen. They knew similar sights must have been all over Europe, and that several fellow American soldiers following behind them were likely finding the same thing. Do you think this is what the paratroopers found when they parachuted into Europe last June? Bride asked after they'd stumbled upon the scene and taken in the true horror. Philip shook his head. I hope not, was all he said. The sight made him sick to see. It was such a pointless waste of life. Bride was the one who had pulled them away from the stream. He placed a hand on Philip's shoulder and turned him away. Then they walked away without looking back. Their first encounter with the enemy had been a scary one, and it had come from the overcast sky and not from the ground. In an open meadow with no cover, the two heard the telltale sound of plane engines roaring in the distance. Duck, Philip said, and he and Bride both crouched low into the grass. A less than desirable hiding place because they were hardly hidden at all, but it was all they had. The two watched as two Messerschmitt Bf 109s flew into view. The two planes passed, distant but close enough the markings on their sides were visible, the pilots obviously scouting for any signs of the Allies advancing into the region. Stay down, Bride whispered. The two sailors stayed still in the high grass, and they watched the two German planes fly past them and into the distance, turning and flying off again into the horizon after they made their pass over the valley. Only when the planes were out of sight over the ridge they'd flown into view over did the sailors stand and continue their trek through Poland. That had been the only encounter with the enemy they'd experienced thus far. They continued forward and traversed the miles without speaking much, resting when they needed, moving towards the mountains, which didn't seem to draw any nearer. It was only after walking for a day after hiding from the planes that they had their first engagement with the enemy. Out of the blue, Phillips had suddenly stopped and exclaimed, "Shit!" and threw himself to the ground behind a bush. Not knowing what his friend had seen, Bride followed his example and did the same. After a moment of nothing happening, he poked his head up and saw what Phillips had seen. He saw Phillips was also peeking through the top blades of grass, and over his friend's shoulder, Bride could see it. Nestled ahead of them, off to their side, was a machine gun nest. It was not abandoned like everything else built by the Germans they'd passed thus far had been. The shapes of German soldiers could be seen sitting in it. Bride crawled up to the bush and peeked through it too, once he was certain they hadn't been spotted. How many are in it? Bride asked after a moment, hanging back. Looks like 3, Phillips answered, not taking his eyes off the gun nest. The hell are they still doing here? The German line is retreating, Bride whispered. Philip shook his head. I think they're taking some lessons from the Japanese, he replied, glancing over his shoulder at Bride. Seeing the confusion on Bride's face, he continued, It's just 3 guys. I think they broke away from their company and stayed behind intentionally. They're going to ambush the Allied line when it comes through here, right over the hill. Whatever group it ends up being, they'll walk into a kill zone, he clarified. That's suicide for them, Bride responded, his voice getting a little louder. The Germans, he added. Phillips motioned him to keep it at a whisper. Exactly. Hence why I said the Japanese are teaching them a thing or two. They know it's suicide. Even a large platoon would overrun them in seconds. They just want to take out as many people with them as they can. They're kamikazes, he said, glancing back at the nest. The nest was circular-shaped, its border lined with sandbags, and sitting at the front was the machine gun resting on a tripod stand, able to be swung around and fired in any direction with deadly accuracy. Assholes, Bride muttered, shaking his head. He sighed. We can't leave it. Phillips tightened the grasp on his rifle, like he was about to stand up and open fire at the nest. I know, he said. Bride put a hand on his shoulder. It's also just the two of us. We can't just rush in there. 10 guys couldn't do it without at least 8 of them getting mowed down first. Use your head, he firmly said. Then added it more of a whisper. So instead, we crawl around them, under their sight line, through this high grass, until we're behind them, and then we can hit them from behind. With any luck, we'll take them all out before they realize and turn that gun around. We can't leave it to ambush whatever battalion comes through. They could take out a lot of our boys if they get the jump on them. Phillips nodded in agreement to the plan and took one more glance at the machine gun nest through the bush. He shook his head, angry. Shit, he hissed out. Then he motioned Bride to follow him with a jerk of his head and got down onto his belly and began pulling himself forward on his elbows and pushing with his legs. Bride did the same and followed after him a moment later. Slowly, keeping as low to the ground as possible, they crept forward, using the grass to keep them out of sight as they began to circle around to the back of the nest. The thick blades of grass kept the nest hidden from view for Phillips and Bride, just as it kept them hidden from the German soldiers sitting in the nest. So Phillips also didn't see the viper ahead of him until he was nearly nose to fangs with it. He jerked back from the venomous snake, which had opened its mouth threateningly. It hissed loudly at the sudden movement and took off, slithering away into the grass. Though he managed to keep from shouting at the startling sight of the deadly snake, the snake itself made noise, both as it hissed and then as it took off into the grass. It was enough for the Germans sitting in the nest to hear it. Phillips and Bride heard them talking, and, with a cautious glance through the top of the blades of grass, they saw one of the soldiers climbing out of the nest. He jumped over the sandbags and started walking in their direction, holding a rifle up and at the ready. Both Phillips and Bride pressed themselves down onto the ground, Bride putting a finger to his lips as the soldier slowly walked closer. As the soldier drew nearer, Phillips very slowly sat up on his elbow, not high enough to be taller than the grass, but he could see through the tops of the blades. Then he slowly brought his own rifle around and aimed it at the approaching soldier, moving slow so as to not audibly brush the grass aside, bringing the sight up level to his eye. He aimed the gun so it was lined up perfectly with the soldier's head. He slowly confirmed a bullet was in the chamber, placed a finger on the trigger, and kept his gun trained on the soldier. He took his eyes off the soldier to look over at Bride. Bride was staring back at him but couldn't move. The approaching soldier was much closer to him than he was to Phillips. Too close for him to even risk shaking his head to tell Phillips not to fire. Phillips returned his gaze down the sight of his rifle, glaring down the barrel at the soldier. It would be a perfect shot if he had to fire. Finally, when the soldier was so close that Phillips could see the grass reflecting in his blue eyes, when he was about to step right on Bride, he stopped. He scanned the fields around the nest, but didn't look down at his feet where Bride was all but laying. Not seeming to be satisfied with not spotting anyone, the soldier brought his rifle up to his shoulder and fired a few shots into the grass, past where Phillips and Bride were laying. It was clear to both that he was trying to flush something, or someone, out. But when nothing jumped out, or seemed to react, the soldier seemed satisfied. He lowered the gun, turned around, and walked back to the nest. Phillips lowered his gun and set up enough to watch until the soldier had climbed back into the nest. Then he dropped to the ground and sighed as quietly as he could. Bride shuddered and allowed the tension to leave his body, and he laid limply on the ground for a few minutes as he tried to stop shaking. His heart was pounding in his ears, and he took several deep but quiet breaths to try and calm himself down. Phillips also slumped onto his back and took a moment to allow the tension to melt away. That had been far too close for comfort. They stayed still for a minute before, prompted by Phillips, they continued to army crawl along to the other side of the nest. Phillips was now watching for any snakes or other animals that he might startle. Slowly, the two sailors continued crawling through the long grass until they finally got around behind the nest, placing them on slightly higher ground than it was, giving them a perfect shot at the soldiers in the nest below them. Lying on the ground side by side, they unslung their rifles and got them ready to fire. "I'll go for the one on the right. You take the one on the left. Then whoever puts their guy down first hits the one in the middle," Phillips whispered, and Bride nodded in agreement. Then they slowly sat up into a squat once they were sure none of the Germans were looking up the rise at them. Once they were ready, Phillips softly counted down from 3. Once he reached 1, he and Bride stood up out of the grass, and they both opened fire at the same time. 2 of the German soldiers in the nest dropped right away once the bullet struck them in the back. The third, the one who had been between the other two, only had time to turn around, a look of shock on his face, before he too was struck in the chest by 2 bullets simultaneously. He was flung back by the bullet striking him, and fell against one of the sandbag walls, splayed out on his back, facing the sky with a blank, open-mouthed expression. With the third soldier on the ground, Phillips and Bride ran forward and aimed their weapons down into the nest. But there were no other soldiers hiding at the bottom. It had only been the 3, which convinced them both all the more that it had indeed been a splinter group who were only trying to kill whomever they could in a final stand. With the skirmish over, they both sighed in relief, and Phillips jumped down into the nest. He stepped over the bodies and ejected the ammunition from the mounted machine gun as Bride kept watch. Once he'd taken it all, he threw the bullets as far off into the grass as he could. He sighed and slung his rifle back over his shoulder, and Bride lowered his own. "Bastards," Bride said. We could have just used one of our grenades, thrown it in once close. They wouldn't have had time to register what it was," he pointed out as Phillips turned to look up at him. Phillips shook his head. "We should probably save them. They might be needed later." "What are we gonna do? Blow up the train?" Bride asked. Phillips shrugged. "Maybe the track," he said, looking down at the bodies lying at his feet at the bottom of the nest. He noted a pendant one was wearing on their collar and picked it off and held it up to his eye. "Look at that. Werewolves," he said. "Looks like the Nazis' little terror force didn't just exist in Goebbels' propaganda." He held the pendant up to Bride. "Souvenir of this jolly old adventure?" Bride asked sarcastically. Phillips shrugged and tossed the pin over his shoulder, chewing on his bottom lip for a moment. Then he kicked one of the corpses. Another reason not to use the grenades. It felt good to do this myself. They deserve it. All of them, he spat. "No argument there," Bride agreed, as Phillips wiped one of his boots on the swastika armband on one of the dead Nazis' uniforms before climbing out of the nest. As he did, Bride slung his gun over his shoulder and pulled their map back out. After a quick scan of it, he said, "That road shouldn't be too much further ahead, another 2 miles maybe. Once we get there, we can follow it straight to the town that Aramore said is where the train is likely to make its last stop before it heads off into the unknown." He looked up. "You need a break, or are you good?" Bride asked. Phillips nodded in reassurance. "I'm good. Let's go." Bride folded the map and stuffed it into his uniform. "I do wish we had some water, though," he admitted, smacking his lips. Phillips looked at him, then took his canteen off its belt, shook it, and held it out to Bride. "There's a few drops left," he said. Bride hesitated, but Phillips shook it again. "Go on, take it." Bride did so, and they set off again, heading towards the road. Though both knew they didn't have a hope in the world of actually stopping the train, unless it was with a grenade, They knew they had to at least try to do what Aaronmore wanted. Just like they had to do on the Eldridge, even after they had realized something was very wrong on the ship. If they didn't at least try, and they managed to survive, then who knew what Aaronmore would do to them? He could easily have them disappeared and no one would ever know. They had to play his game, and now wondered how many others of those who had been sent on to the Eldridge after them had also had to go on near certain death assignments for the man, and how many others he'd already had killed in ways that wouldn't raise any eyebrows. Certain strange events befalling various ships or soldiers they'd heard about now made them wonder. The two eventually came to the road they were looking for. It was a dirt road, worn with wheel tracks from both wagons and motorized vehicles. It worked its way through the fields and forests of the countryside, vanishing around a bend behind a hill to their right and working its way off into the distance on their left. Phillips and Bride came to it as they reached the bottom of a hill. The dirt road ran along the base of two of them on each side, and the bushes and long grass reached out into the road as if trying to consume it. They'd only just stepped onto it and off the hill when they heard something coming around the bend to their right. "Hide!" Bride whispered, grabbing Phillips and pulling him back into one of the bushes growing along the side of the road. Lying in a ditch under the shrub, weapons held at the ready, they watched as a horse-drawn wagon came around the bend in the road, heading in the direction they'd be traveling as well. It was being pulled by a single horse and being driven by what seemed to be a lone German infantryman. Phillips and Bride watched from their hiding place as the wagon drove past, noticing it was loaded with wooden crates in the back. As the wagon passed them, Phillips suddenly jumped up and ran out onto the road behind it. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the back of the soldier's head, the bullet punching through his helmet. He slumped forward and the horse reared back and neighed in alarm as Phillips ran forward to calm it down. Stunned for a moment at the sudden action, Bride didn't react for a moment, not until Phillips had calmed the horse and was climbing up into the wagon and patting down the body. "Damn it," he grumbled, crawling out of the bush and coming out onto the road as well. "William, what the fuck are you doing?" he yelled. Phillips didn't answer. He checked to confirm the soldier was dead, patted the body down, and pulled a Hitler Youth knife from one of the uniform pockets, and climbed into the back of the wagon, opening the crates and rifling through the contents. "William!" Bride sputtered. Phillips didn't answer, not until he'd opened the last crate. "No art or gold anywhere. All they have are crates loaded with these," he said, pulling out a clean, folded uniform. He set his rifle down and held one up to show Bride. "These are Waffen-SS uniforms." He looked at the uniform and then back at Bride. "We need to change into them and get out of ours. We may as well be wearing American flags if we stay in what we're wearing right now. Not what we want to be wearing when we walk straight into the town ahead, which is going to be full of these guys," Phillips said. Bride sighed in frustration, grumbled, but nodded in agreement and caught one of the uniforms when Philip threw him the shirt, followed by the pants from another crate. "Any helmets?" Bride asked after catching both articles of clothing. Philip shook his head. Bride nodded. "All right, we'll have to ditch ours then. It'll be pretty conspicuous to walk into a town full of Nazis wearing American helmets," he said, unclipping his helmet and taking it off. He tossed it over into the grass, and Phillips repeated the action a moment later. "Some treasure hunter will find those in 100 years, Bride said. They both then grabbed the SS uniforms and began to slide them on. As Bride slid it on over the uniform he already had on, he felt dirty putting on a uniform that was designed to associate the wearer with some of the very worst of the Nazis. Philip seemed to feel the same because neither took their American uniforms off, save the helmets. They just put the SS uniforms on over the top of it. As he and Phillips changed into their disguises, Bride spoke again. "What's going on with you? Why are you charging head-on into every opportunity for a fight?" Phillips also sighed in frustration and looked at Bride as he was buttoning up the SS uniform over his own, but after a moment he answered. "I'm just going through some stuff right now. The sinking of the 73 really just dredged some old feelings back up, okay?" Bride shook his head, but also gave an understanding nod, though he wished Phillips would have gone into more detail about what exactly was bothering him. Just keep your temper in check from here on, okay? The more skirmishes we get into, the more likely we are to get noticed. I hate these guys just as much as you do, but for God's sake, think your actions through. Just think about it next time. You're gonna get us both killed if you keep this up. Those words ripped into Phillips like a knife, doing more damage than any bullet ever could. He didn't answer. He just focused on finishing buttoning up his disguise. Once he had the SS uniform on over the top of his own, Philip slipped the Hitler Youth knife into his waist belt that he was wearing underneath the SS uniform. But he slipped the holster with his pistol onto the belt he was wearing on the outside. Bride didn't think to conceal anything on himself. Once they were in uniform, they grabbed their weapons off the ground, freed the horse and smacked it on the hindquarters to send it on its way, hid the body in the grass, and set off down the road towards the town. Once we're no longer in hostile territory, we'll talk about what you're dealing with, okay? Just for now, keep your head level, Bride said as they set off. A few miles down the road, as it crested a hill, the two sailors paused and then ducked behind some small trees, looking down below them. They hadn't reached the town yet, but something had appeared ahead. The road went down the hill and then back up another, but before it did, it passed by a lone farmhouse in the vale. There was no movement around the house, but what seemed to be a tiger tank was sitting behind it, near the barn and animal corral. Phillips and Bride shared a look. "What do you think?" Bride asked. Phillips looked down at the house. "We have to check it." It was the perfect place to observe for the movement of enemy troops, and the tank showed that the Germans had taken it over at some point. Bride nodded in agreement, and they crept out from behind the trees. Slowly creeping towards the house, Bride put a hand on Phillips's shoulder. "If someone is there, do you think it'll look less conspicuous if we're just walking towards the house rather than sneaking, given what we're wearing?" Phillips glanced down at the SS uniform he had on, then nodded. He didn't sling his rifle, but held it more casually and stood up straight. "It's the opposite of the Eldridge. We couldn't go 2 feet on that ship without sneaking," he mused. Bride cracked a small smile, and they proceeded down the road towards the house. When they reached it, they approached the front door and Phillips pushed it open. He and Bride stood up straight, trying to look official and demanding respect on the off chance some Germans were inside, but the house was empty. Stepping inside, they found the owner's possessions had been shoved into a side room, and that the living room and kitchen had clearly been used by the Nazis for something. A left-behind radio set hinted at the home being used as a listening station of some kind. It seemed the Germans had left recently, and in a hurry. A half-eaten sandwich was still on a plate. As Phillips scanned through the home, Bride looked over into the room where the owner's possessions were piled up. The little girl's porcelain doll was sticking out of the pile, staring sadly at the floor. Bride shook his head in disbelief. "They chased a family out of their home," he said. "I hope they chased a family out of their home," he added, thinking back to the stream. It was as if the Nazis wanted the world to burn now that they couldn't have it. He entered the main room and looked at what radio equipment had been left behind. Something next to it on the table also grabbed his attention, and he picked it up. It was a German colonel's visor cap. Phillips came back into the room. They didn't just, hopefully, chase the family off. "Come here," he said. Bride dropped the hat back on the table and followed him down into another hallway, and stopped when Phillips pointed at the floor. "Tripwire," Phillips said. It was at the end of the hall, at the entrance to another larger room. The curtains to the room had been pulled closed, plunging it into near total darkness, save the slits of light that broke through the fabric. Cautiously, Bride peeked his head around the corner and looked back at Phillips. When they left, they filled the house with explosives and left a tank out back to bait our boys in when they passed by. That many crates of explosives in there are enough that it could take out a whole division if someone stepped on that wire. Would for sure take out the whole house and yard. He shook his head. Pricks, he scoffed. Phillips nodded. Yeah, he agreed, stepping back from the wire and went out the back door. He now had his gun up, on the off chance some of the Germans were still around. Bride followed him, and they approached the tank. Stopping the train would be easy if we could figure out how to work it, Bride commented. Phillips nodded and slung his rifle over his shoulder. He climbed up onto, and then inside of the tank, but re-emerged at the top a moment later, shaking his head. They completely destroyed the controls. This thing will never move again. He climbed out of the tank and jumped back onto the ground. Let's go. There's nothing for us here. We're wasting time we don't have. They went back inside and, after finding some scissors, they cautiously cut the tripwire and left the house, heading back onto the road to continue towards the town they were seeking. It didn't take long after that before the road wound its way through the fields and countryside, through a small wood, and then down into the village. It was a tiny place with mostly wooden buildings. At the opposite end of the town from where Phillips and Bride were approaching it was a rail line, and sitting at what was clearly a train station was a train. All around it and throughout the town, Nazi soldiers were walking around, entering and exiting buildings, and loading crates of varying sizes onto the train cars. Most of the cars were cargo-oriented, though there was one armored train car adorning an anti-aircraft gun, and a few others were also passenger cars. Several soldiers were boarding as well, while others seemed to be staying back. Vehicles were also coming in from other roads and stopping around the train, with their own cargo being emptied out and placed onto the train. The Nazis were clearly evacuating, and doing it quickly. There were no civilians anywhere in sight, both sailors noticed. It seemed the entire population of the town had been relocated, just like the family from the farm had been. It seemed the population had been put on trucks and driven away, hopefully not in the same way the other town's populace had been relocated. By the time they arrived in the town, the sun had all but set. Some gray-orange color remained in the sky to the west, but other than that, it was fully dark out. Due to the overcast sky, no stars were visible, but the glow from the waning half-moon faintly was. A ghostly pale white orb shining through the clouds vaguely revealed where the moon was. The poor, near-moonless nighttime light obscured Phillips and Bride as they arrived and aided them in not being noticed. No one looked Phillips and Bride's way as they walked into the town. Walking along the main road like they belonged there, Bride leaned over and whispered to Phillips, "That's it," as he pointed at the train. Phillips nodded. "Now let's just find out where it's going." They headed straight for the train station. Several distracted soldiers hurried past them. No one looked at them or spoke to them. Everyone seemed to have an assigned task and they were hurrying to complete it. One soldier shoved past the two and muttered something but didn't look at them. It was a strange feeling. As Phillips pointed out earlier, on the USS Eldridge, he and Bride had been forced to try and stay out of sight of every person on the ship. But here, even though those instincts were screaming at them to hide, they could just walk right past the threat right out in the open. If they didn't draw attention to themselves, they knew they'd probably not be noticed. If we find any unoccupied helmets, we should probably put them on. Less chance someone will notice us because right now we're the only ones without them, Phillips whispered as they walked up the street. Bride nodded, but it wasn't entirely true, technically. The captains, colonels, and other commanders overseeing the hurried evacuation were wearing hats. As Phillips and Bride reached the train station, they glanced at the train they'd come so far to find. "You think we can slip on and hijack it now?" Bride asked. Phillips shook his head. "No. Look at the amount of passenger cars versus how many people are here. Not everyone is leaving with the train. Our best bet is to find out where it's going and head that way so we can cut it off. Less people to contend with," Phillips whispered. "Besides, do you know how to drive a train?" "No," Bride admitted. Phillips nodded. "Me neither. We'd be gunned down if we tried now." They slung their rifles over their shoulders and walked into the train station. Some lanterns were burning on a few tables, but the building was empty. Charts and lists were lying on tables everywhere. It seemed to be a checklist of what had and hadn't arrived, or what had and hadn't been picked up at previous stops. On one wall, tacked onto it, was a large map of Poland. Bride reached under his disguise and pulled out from a pocket in his uniform the map of the rail lines in Poland that Aaronmore had given them back in the United States. He unfolded it and walked towards the wall with the larger map. Phillips grabbed a lantern and followed him. Bride spread out the map and held it against the wall as Phillips held the light up, checking theirs with the Nazis' version, looking for differences in rail lines heading south towards the mountains. At first seeing no differences, Bride located the town they were in on their map and began tracing the rail line running out of it and comparing it to the big map as he did. Then they both saw it. A rail line that didn't exist on their map branched off from the same line on the Nazis' version, and it ran straight into the mountains. No such branch was present on theirs. Bride felt adrenaline rush through him. "That's it," he softly gasped. That was the plan. The train would merge off the line on their map and onto the secret line that wasn't on theirs, and from there, it would head into the mountains. "God damn," Phillips softly replied. "They really do have a secret rail line. The train goes that way, merges off the main line, and vanishes. And I bet the guys who stay here follow later and destroy the line, and that's it. No one would ever find the train." Bride shook his head. "Brilliant," he couldn't help but say. "You want to hide your spoils of war? Build a secret rail line to do it, and then destroy it when you're done." They knew at that moment the train was picking up a large amount of stolen art and gold that had been brought to this last stop before it set off and was hidden. They could only imagine what works and masterpieces were stashed in those crates being loaded onto the train at that very moment. Another town with a train station was further down the line, but the secret line on the Nazis' map branched off from the line before the train would reach it. Once it headed down the route that didn't exist on their map, it would reach an area of the mountains filled with abandoned coal mines, hundreds of them. No doubt it would go inside one of those mines and never be seen again. "It's gonna go into an abandoned coal mine," Bride said. Phillips shook his head. "They told us in the brief there's hundreds in that area. If it gets there, no one will ever find it. It's such an easy place to make something disappear. All they have to do is rip up or bury the tracks on their way and seal off the entrance, and it just looks like part of the mountain. I think you're right that a large number of these guys are going to stay here and destroy the tracks once the train goes through. The ones going on the train are probably going to guard it just in case." Bride shook his head. "God damn it," he swore, louder than he intended, but no one outside seemed to hear. With the amount of passenger cars that the train was pulling, only around 1/3 of the soldiers in the town could fit on the train at the absolute most. Meaning, at least 2/3 would be staying back and likely destroying the tracks before retreating further into territory still firmly under Nazi control. "So, what do we do?" Bride asked. "Well, we can't hijack it, but maybe we can slip on while it's being loaded. Where the secret line branches off isn't far. If we're not on the train when it leaves, I don't know if we could catch it," Phillips said, examining the map again. A voice suddenly came from the door, and the two turned around to see 3 Nazi soldiers standing in the doorway to the station. The one in the middle marched towards the two, flanked by his fellows, who were armed, and then shouted something. Not knowing what to do, neither Phillips or Bride knew what to say. They didn't speak, and the man grabbed the map from Bride's hand. He scanned it and then seemed to notice something because his eyes widened. The soldier suddenly looked back up at them with an accusatory glare. He turned the map to face the two. Only now did Phillips and Bride notice something minute that they hadn't picked up on before, but now knew was very intentional. Aaronmore's personal seal had been stamped on the bottom right corner of the map, and the United States Navy symbol had been stamped on the left. Those had not been on the version of the map Aaronmore had shown them in Alaska. He had added them to this one himself. The soldier shouted again, likely demanding to know why an American commanding officer's personal seal was on a map in the possession of what appeared to be Nazi SS soldiers. When Phillips and Bride still didn't answer, he snarled something in German, and the other 2 soldiers grabbed Phillips and Bride and dragged them outside. The soldier who had taken the map marched out the door and shouted something. As soon as Phillips and Bride were pulled outside, several other soldiers ran up, took their weapons, and hastily patted them down. They looked distracted by the bigger task, but felt in all the pockets. They took the grenades, pistols, and other weapons they could find. Once the search was done, Phillips and Bride were pulled out onto the road and marched towards the train. The soldier who had taken the map was speaking to a well-dressed captain, who turned to face the scene and walked towards Phillips and Bride. They were restrained in place as the Nazi captain stopped right in front of them. He stared at the two without speaking for a moment, his icy eyes licking over each detail of what he might have assumed to be busted informants for the Americans at best. He had a poker face as good as Aaronmore, and nothing got through the armor. There was no chink in it to read or hint at what he was thinking. The Nazi captain then seemed to notice something off about Bride's uniform and pointed at it, loudly ordering something in German the two didn't understand. A soldier stepped forward and roughly undid a few buttons and pulled Bride's outer uniform back, revealing his American uniform underneath. The captain seemed to tense up, and his eyes widened slightly. "Americans," he hissed. The soldiers all around began to look in all directions, as if expecting an attack to come at any second. The captain froze from his surprise only for a moment before he looked around and shouted out several quick orders in German. Soldiers suddenly began running all around, grabbing boxes and taking them to the train, or loading tools onto trucks. It seemed the evacuation was picking up the pace. The captain then turned to face Phillips and Bride again. After looking at them for a moment, he turned to his men and began speaking. When it came to the German language, Phillips was hopeless, but Bride could sometimes understand one word in three, but he didn't understand a word of what the captain was saying. He dreaded what it was if it was relating to him and Phillips. As several soldiers closed in on Phillips and Bride, the captain barked again and they stopped. He turned away and grabbed 2 ropes from the back of a truck and tossed them to 2 soldiers standing behind the 2 sailors. He'd ordered them to execute the Americans, but not waste the bullets they need later while doing it. Phillips and Bride were marched out of the town and up a hill, flanked by 10 soldiers. Soon a line of trees came into view at the top of the hill, and the 2 German soldiers leading the march stepped forward. They checked a few trees with the lanterns they were holding, seemed to find one they thought was satisfactory, and then tied 2 nooses at the end of each rope. They threw the other end up into a tree with large branches. Bride began panicking at the sight, knowing what they were going to do to them. "Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God," he stammered, tears he couldn't hold back beginning to fall down his face. Phillips didn't say anything. He just looked at the ground, looking like he'd resigned himself to what was about to happen, and to the fact they couldn't escape with so many armed soldiers guarding them. Out of the 10, 8 had their guns pointed at the Americans. The other 2 were getting the ropes ready. The soldiers seemed to be in a big hurry, because they hastily tied Phillips and Bride's hands behind their backs, then slipped the nooses over their heads and tightened them around their necks, then walked them to the base of the trees. The 2 who seemed to be in charge of hanging them then stepped back and grabbed the other ends of the ropes, giving a tentative tug to make sure the branches would hold the weight. Then, pulling on the end of the ropes, the Germans hoisted the sailors up off the ground. Bride gasped and began trying to free his hands as his airway was forcefully cut off. Once the 2 were several feet off the ground, the Nazis tied the ropes around the other tree to keep the Americans hanging from the branch and stood back to watch. As he hung by his neck from the branch, Bride tried everything he could to get the noose away from his neck, but it wasn't a battle he was winning. His legs were kicking empty air, seeking any foothold, but none were there. He gasped over and over, but only pulled a tiny amount of air in with each gasp, not enough to keep his strength up. As the seconds ticked by, he became frantic for air and kicked out more desperately, but each kick only made the noose feel like it tightened around his neck even more. He needed to breathe so desperately, and he gasped for air over and over, but he just couldn't breathe. Bride gasped, but no air came in, and trying to move the rope away from his neck did no good. He actually got his hands free somehow and grabbed at the rope, but as both the lack of oxygen and the weakness in his arms he'd already been dealing with combined, Bride lost the ability to try and keep the noose from strangling him, and he stopped fighting. His body went limp and he hung there, rope tight against his throat, his mind fogging and his vision slowly blurring and fading to darkness. The light from the lanterns the soldiers were holding was the last thing to fade away. He slowly stopped swinging as the moments passed and hung from the tree, unable to move as the feeling in all of his limbs ebbed away to nothingness. Bride's last coherent thought was that Aaronmore was going to get what he really wanted, after all. The breath suddenly gushed back into his body, and Bride gasped. His eyes shot open, and he saw the limbs of the tree above him. He was lying on his back on the ground and sat up, gasping and coughing at the same time. His hands went to his neck, and he yelped as he felt the noose still tied around his neck. In a panic, he grabbed the rope, pulled it over his head, and threw it off to the side. He then fell back onto the ground and took several deep breaths, trying not to break down and sob. He failed. Philip sat next to him, massaging his own neck, but otherwise seeming to be handling being hung by the neck much better than Bride was. But he didn't interrupt his friend and let him cry until he stopped on his own. Once he had mostly calmed down, Bride wiped his eyes and sat up. He coughed and asked, "How?" His voice was very hoarse. Phillips looked down at the ground and held up the Hitler Youth knife he'd taken from the young soldier driving the wagon. He waved it slightly before lowering it again. "They didn't find it when they patted me down. They just took what I had on the outside. Either they didn't notice or just didn't think I had anything stashed under the borrowed uniform," he said. "But how?" Bride asked again, still taking deep breaths to get oxygen back into his system. Phillips looked at him. "I faked passing out. I just had to hope they really were in a rush to get out of here, even more so because of us, and they would leave once we passed out." He shrugged. "They did. Once you went limp as well, they only stayed for a second and then turned and walked away." He paused to rub the bruise visibly developing around his neck. "Once they were gone, I got my hands free because the knots they tied weren't very good. God, it hurt though because I've really been feeling that weakness in my arms over the last few hours, but I was able to do it. Once I did, I grabbed the rope strangling me with one hand, and I reached the other under the SS uniform, pulled the knife out, and cut the rope. Fall almost knocked me out, but didn't. I then cut the rope anchoring you in place. You weren't breathing, so I had to give you rescue breaths. After a few seconds of that, you gasped and woke up." Bride took everything Philip said in for a moment, rubbing his aching neck for a moment, and spoke again. "Thank you." That was all he said before he looked down at the ground, shaking his head. He sniffed and wiped fresh tears from his eyes. Another cry was threatening. He held it in and wiped his eyes again to keep the tears back. "It's all fucked up. All of it," Bride said, his voice breaking. Phillips nodded. "Yeah, it is," he agreed, looking at the knife that had saved their lives, taken after the end of another. They sat under the tree for a few minutes in silence, but Phillips finally sighed and spoke again. "John, I've not been myself. I know it. He paused. "I've been dealing with self-doubt ever since the experiment. And the sinking of the 73 really brought it back in full force, like I told you earlier." Bride looked over at him as Phillips continued. "The sinking made it worse, because you came back and saved my skin. If you didn't, I would have drowned. I wouldn't have gotten that bed frame off me. It's not just that you came back for me, it's I did the exact opposite to someone else. Back on the Eldridge, there was this young guy, about our age, younger, I think. I don't know who he was. He'd been fused into a bedpost by whatever the hell happened. He was alive, totally fine in the head, unlike a majority of the crew. He was pleading with me, save me or put me out of my misery, but there were these deranged guys outside who'd been driven insane by the experiment on the ship. At first I thought they'd been driven into an animal-like state. They were hunting like big cats almost, but then I saw them pull out knives and attack this frozen sailor, and that made it much scarier because that meant they were still as smart as me. They weren't rabid animals mindlessly attacking something. It meant rather they were people, an uncontrollable urge to kill. Philip sighed. I was so scared. I was backed into a corner and basically gave that guy to them on a silver platter. He was fused to a bed. He couldn't move anywhere. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight back. So I shot him. I thought about doing it in the head so he wouldn't feel what they did, but I needed him to scream so they'd go for him. So they wouldn't think to look for me. It's pleading with me not to do it, but I did. I shot him in the shoulder, they came in, and I ran once they started ripping into this poor man. I did it so fast, too. It was the first thing I did. Save myself was all I was thinking. Everyone else be damned. They ripped that lad apart, and I ran from the room while they were distracted. I never once considered trying to save him. He looked over at Bride now. You know what happened next? You found me on deck being attacked by those sailors crawling on all fours. I was out of bullets, but you saved my skin. You didn't leave me out to dry and save yourself. Ever since that day, I've always worried that I wouldn't be able to be the kind of person who can stay back and save someone. Even you or Tom if he was still here. I essentially killed that sailor to save my own skin, and ever since, I've never been able to see myself as the kind of person who wouldn't do it again, or the person who wouldn't leave someone behind. I thought for a long time I'd gotten past it, and I told myself I'd follow a friend into battle anywhere, but damn, it really came back after the sinking. After you came back to save me. It's made me so angry. It's made me lash out, be reckless. Sometimes I want to die, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I've been acting since January. God. He trailed off and put his hand to his head, rubbing his temple. God, forgive me. Bride didn't respond for a moment, then said, It's not true. William, I know you. I know you would go back for me, or for Blake, or Tom. You would. Philip shook his head. You don't know me, he said. God damn it, William, I do, Bride said, speaking louder even though it hurt his throat. Phillips whipped around to face him. Did you not hear me? He snapped. I killed that guy on the Eldridge. I mean, I didn't, but I did at the same time. Ever since, I've always had this doubt about if I'd be able to go back for a comrade. Even my best friend, you! Sinking really brought it all back up. That's why my temper's been so short lately. It's why I've rushed into every fight like that machine gun nest or that guy driving the wagon. You're right. I did just rush out there when the wagon went by. My temper got to me. I didn't check if anyone else was around. You kind of knocked some sense into me after. If you hadn't, I'd have probably just started chucking grenades once they grabbed us. But I did what you said. Bided time until I had a chance. So you see, ever since the experiment, I've had doubts doubts as to if I could go back and save someone, or if I could stay back and not throw someone to the wolves. And that's twice in the last 3 months you've saved my life. That's what I'm dealing with right now. You don't get how it makes me feel. I don't deserve to be your friend. I'm a selfish asshole who only cares about himself. He shook his head as if Bride hadn't heard a word he had said the first time. He couldn't fathom that Bride would remain so calm with him considering what he'd told him. Yeah, I heard you. I heard you explain it the first time. I heard you. You're not hearing me, Bride eventually retorted. You're not hearing me when I say you are the best friend I met outside of that theater with Blake. You're the funny man from our little posse. I remember you warned me about what Bruno did on C Deck. Funny guy, that Bruno. You saved my skin on the Elder Ridge when we saw that guy in the passageway. I froze, locked up. You grabbed me and pulled me out of there. And on the Elder Ridge, you know what else you did? I realized the wireless operator might be alive. I turned around and ran right back inside that ship of horrors. And you came with me. You followed me back inside when neither of us had any bullets left. Those afflicted crew members were getting closer to the upper decks, but you still followed me back inside that ship, and you didn't hesitate. I know what kind of man you are. Bride looked at him. I know what kind of man my best friend is. A man I'd follow into battle anywhere, and a man I know will always have my back no matter how dire a situation gets. When Phillips looked back at him, this time it was him who had tears filling his eyes. He seemed to be overwhelmed quickly because Bride suddenly found himself being pulled into a painful hug as Phillips began to sob, shaking sobs as the emotions he'd held inside himself since that day in 1943 finally spilled out of him. Phillips's whole body shook with the force of his emotional crack-up. Each body-shaking sob was so powerful, it was like Phillips was being struck in the back with a hammer swung by a strong man you'd see perform in a circus. You are a good man. Don't ever tell yourself otherwise. How do you think Tom would feel if he knew you were thinking this way? Bride asked. Phillips sat back and chuckled a little, still crying. He'd think I'd gone bananas, he said, laughing. I'm thinking that too, Bride chuckled. Philip shook his head. Watch it, or I might not tell you next time Bruno does something. They both laughed. Despite the situation they were in, they laughed. You remember that time Bruno set his parents' barn on fire? Bride asked after a moment. Philip shook his head. No, I don't actually, he sarcastically replied with a slight chuckle. But what I do remember is that time you had that mouse in your house and Bruno thought it was a good idea to bring the neighbor's cat in to catch it. Yeah, suddenly we had an angry cat running around and clawing the house up, Bride said, chuckling and shaking his head. Bruno then decided to bring in another neighbor's dog to chase the cat out. And when that didn't work, Bruno decided, okay, enough of that, Philip said. Okay, but I will add that I remember Bruno got his butt tanned by both my dad and his, Bride replied. Good thing Bruno got stopped. Who knows what he would have come back with next. He might have tried to bring an alligator in next. Gotta use what was around, and they were in the canal, Phillips mused. Bride shook his head, still laughing. That troublemaker would have found a way to catch one, he said. Maybe even old Captain Bones, that legendary 20-footer that lived in the canal. Phillips chuckled. Old enough he ate a few traitors during the Civil War. Old Johnny swore almost every day in school he saw old Captain Bones fighting a shark in the bay once. There was a moment of silence. Then Bride chuckled. Bruno always did rush into a situation without thinking the details through. Phillips nodded. He did, he agreed, a small grin on his face. They sat in silence under the tree for a moment before Bride half smiled as well. Do you think Bruno has sunk any U-boats? Phillips snorted. If he has, we both might owe him a drink, he chuckled. Bride shook his head slightly. You know, when we made that bet, I always thought it would be Tom who won. We always called him Deadeye when we went shooting. Phillips nodded. No bottle or can was safe. Now that they had a quiet moment, amid the calamity of the war, the two both truly felt the losses of their respective siblings again for the first time since the experiment. Bride wiped his eyes. What do you think happened to them? He asked. Phillips shook his head. I don't know. I just hope it was quick. I wish they were still here, though. I think Tom would have really knocked some sense into me years ago. A sudden whistle in the distance brought the two back to the moment, and they looked down into the town. The train was moving. The cars had been loaded and were slowly being pulled away from the station down the tracks by the engine. Bride stood. Shit. He looked at the train pulling away, then held a hand out to Phillips. Phillips looked at him and Bride said, "We have to do something." Phillips nodded and took his hand. He stood up next to Bride, sliding his knife underneath his outer uniform again. After Bride pulled Phillips to his feet, they looked down at the town, seeing the train was pulling away and picking up speed. Bride shook his head. "We have to go after it. We have to try." "How?" "Make it up. It's what we've been doing," Bride replied. "Any ideas?" Phillips bit his lip, then nodded after a moment. "There's a tunnel not too far ahead down the tracks. A couple of them. I saw them on the map. We can catch it at one of them." "And then what?" Bride asked. "Board it like cowboys holding a train up?" Phillips shrugged. He then took off at a run towards the town without further thought. Bride shook his head. "God damn it, Bruno's back," he said, though he couldn't keep the smile from spreading on his face. For the first time since that day in 1943, William Phillips was back. With a grin on his face, Bride followed a few seconds after Phillips. They hurried down the hill and snuck into the town. They kept out of sight, but Phillips had to take out one guard with his knife when they found where the weapons were being stored. Remaining undetected, they hid the body inside a barn, stole rifles, and slung them over their shoulders. They stole pistols and slid them into their holsters, made sure they had ammo for each, and then found that the Nazis had horses in the town. They were tied to trees near a few vehicles, but ready to ride. Before any of the Nazis left in the town knew what was happening, the two Americans who had been marched off to be hanged burst out onto the main road, riding their own horses. Phillips and Bride rode in a quick circle around several bewildered Nazis as they caught their bearings, and then with a kick to spur the horses, they took off at a full gallop. Before any of the Nazis could really react beyond shouting, the Americans rode out on horseback to the end of the street, turned off the road at the station, and took off at a full gallop down the tracks. Several soldiers yelled and gave chase on foot, but the Americans quickly rode out of the town, following along the tracks, following the train. The few soldiers who tried to follow stopped the chase quickly, seeing it was a lost cause. One shouted and threw his helmet to the ground in anger as the Americans rode out of sight down the tracks. Achieving its full speed, the train rumbled down the tracks. It entered a wooden area, the forest on all sides serving as good concealment from possible Allied planes that could begin flying over any time. Even if they did, an armored rail car near the front of the train had a powerful anti-aircraft gun at the ready to shoot them down. Those on board felt smug and sure that they'd escaped with all the stolen gold and artifacts that had managed to reach the train before its final departure for the secret line. Some of the work stashed on board went back several centuries, some even thousands of years. And once they were hidden away, the Allies would never find them. Finally, if the Nazi regime ever bounced back, they could recover the artifacts. Those on board were riding to their destination in luxury, surrounded by it too, and passed the time smoking, talking, eating, or playing card games, and keeping watch, of course. Most were already celebrating, though. The train was nearing the point where it would turn off the map line onto the secret track. Soon, it would reach the mountains and be hidden away, with all the art, artifacts, gold, and information on secret projects that was stashed on board. As Phillips and Bride rode through the trees, leaving the tracks behind and cutting through a patch of woods to try and cut out a massive loop of the tracks and catch up with the train when it reached the nearest bridge, they both heard a roar approaching from behind, as well as seeing a growing glow of bright light. Looking over their shoulders, they saw that they were still being pursued. A vehicle, similar looking to a Jeep, it was hard to tell for sure with the headlights shining on them, was speeding up behind them, kicking up dirt, small rocks, and leaves behind it into a swirling cloud that spun back to the ground. A large mounted machine gun was nestled in its bed, looking like an MG-42. There was a driver behind the wheel, no passenger though, and another soldier standing in the back where the gun was, both hands firmly grasped onto it. A patch of trees growing too close together to drive between but not too tight for Phillips and Bride to ride through, forced the driver to veer to Phillips and Bride's left as the vehicle finally came parallel alongside them, with that thick patch of trees the only thing still separating them. The man standing in the back swiveled the gun around to the right and opened fire at them, the flashes like quick fiery balls of lightning, the shots loud in the night, even over the roar of the engine. Bullets tore through the leaves and bark of the trees between the riders and the vehicle and pelted the air all around Phillips and Bride. The sailors heard them whizzing all around them, in front, over, past, behind, and to the sides. Phillips's horse whinnied, both of her nostrils flared wide enough they could have easily engulfed a golf ball each, and he had to tighten his grasp on the reins to keep her from rearing or bolting uncontrollably. The German continued to fire at them, with only the occasional reprieve if the trees grew too dense to shoot through, but as soon as they thinned out, he would fire again. The vehicle slowed and kept pace alongside the horses now, no matter how hard Phillips and Bride tried to push the animals to go faster. Awkwardness of the situation be damned, Phillips and Bride unslung their rifles and both held them one-handed, pointing towards their left, holding the weapons with their arms extended outward, the other pressed in close and still gripping the reins as they tried to keep the horses under control. They knew they had to fight before one of them got hit by a lucky bullet. The only thing that had saved them thus far was that they were moving targets in the dark being fired at from a moving vehicle swerving to avoid obstacles, and that there were trees and other objects between them and the gunner the entire time. But someone was going to get a lucky shot off eventually. If enough bullets kept flying in the air, it would be inevitable. Hardly able to look at the Germans as they guided the horses through the trees, hazards often only coming into view ahead of them, moments before they would have crashed into them due to the darkness, Phillips and Bride both began opening fire with their rifles one-handed, hoping they didn't lose their grip on their respective guns with each recoil, or that something would smack them out of their hands. Aiming in the general direction between the vehicle's headlights and the gun flashes in its bed, they kept firing, only able to get quick glances to adjust their awkward aim, hoping to hit one of the two before their clips ran out. Despite the impossibility of the shot, one of Phillips's hit true. The driver's face suddenly exploded into a red mist of bone fragments on the windshield as the bullet tore an opening right through his right temple. His grip on the wheel slackened and the vehicle veered widely. The Nazi standing in the back panicked and shouted as the vehicle smashed into a large fallen tree. With a scream, he was flung over his gun, above the windshield, and the momentum carried him out way past the hood of the vehicle and over the tree. He crashed onto the ground in front of it, head and neck first. Seeing the crash, Phillips and Bride both slung their rifles over their shoulders again and spurred the horses forward faster with a smack of the reins. They could see glimpses of the lights coming from the train cars again now through the trees as they drew near to the track again. They had overtaken it, but only just. Ahead through the trees, Phillips, who was in front, saw a steep but short slope rise up and then appear to flatten out. The trees seemed to end at the base of it, and the area at the top was open. He could see the moon's light again at the top. The clouds seemed to have thinned or finally cleared. He looked over his shoulder at Bride. "I bet that's the road. Come on, we have to beat it to the crossing." He whipped around in the saddle and snapped the reins again. "Yeah!" he shouted, spurring his horse right up the slope without losing much momentum. Bride mirrored the action, slightly awkwardly, but he directed his horse up after Phillips's. Cresting the slope and coming right out on the road they'd hoped to find, Phillips and Bride turned to the left and rode towards where it crossed over the train tracks. They came to the overpass quickly and saw the train passing through the tunnel under the road. "Yeah!" Phillips yelled, kicking his horse in the side to speed it up. Bride did the same, snapping the reins to make his go faster. At the tunnel, they dismounted and looked down at the train cars passing underneath. The train was moving fast, and most of the cars were already through the tunnel. Phillips lightly tapped Bride on the stomach. "Jump!" he said. "What?" Bride stuttered over the sound of the train. Phillips nodded and patted Bride's arm. "Yeah, like cowboys holding up a train, remember?" he said, and leapt onto the roof of the car passing underneath the bridge. It was nearly the last one. "Oh God," Bride said, but did so as well, following his friend, and landed right behind Phillips on the roof. The tunnel quickly fell into the distance behind them. "Let's go," Phillips said, pulling Bride up, and the two took off at a run across the roof towards the engine. They reached the end of the first car and jumped onto the next one. "The train is moving southwest quickly," Bride shouted, "and gaining speed fast. The place it'll merge off isn't far ahead. Let's see if we can get to the engine before it gets there," Phillips replied, and they began running again. If we can't stop it, maybe we can still find a way to derail it. They leapt from car to car, working their way up the line quickly, but the engine didn't seem to get closer no matter how many cars they jumped to. The train was pulling way more cars of looted art and gold than they'd first thought. Each leap was a gamble in the darkness. A single misstep would have sent either of them plummeting underneath the wheels. The wind was howling by like a typhoon, and the wheels below the train cars were roaring, becoming louder like a screaming beast as the train gained speed. How many cars of stolen artifacts are they hauling? Bride asked, after they jumped to the fifth car, each loaded with plundered art. Philip stopped, but he didn't answer Bride's question. He held out a hand to stop Bride and squinted at something ahead, hardly even a visible outline in the dark. Bride expected Phillips to motion them forward again, but instead he jerked back. "Shit! Duck!" Phillips shouted, throwing himself to the roof and pressing himself flat against it. Bride saw what Phillips had and quickly did the same, throwing himself onto the floor next to him. Moments later, the train car they were on passed underneath another tunnel. The last one before the merge-off. The brick top of the tunnel was mere inches above the two sailors' backs. Once the tunnel passed, Bride gasped like the wind had been sucked out of him. "Holy shit!" Phillips tapped his arm. "Come on, most cars have doors on the end where they couple together. We'll go down through the door and go through the cars as long as we can, rather than over them," he said, jumping to his feet. He pulled Bride to his feet as well, and they hurried to the end of the car. They climbed down the ladder and jumped over the coupler to the next car. The next car, by chance, happened to be a passenger car, and they opened it and went inside. They met eyes with several surprised Nazis who were standing at the booths in the car. Everyone froze, some halfway through setting down a playing card. The stare-off lasted for a few seconds, then everyone started raising their guns. Phillips and Bride had their rifles up first and opened fire at the soldiers. Several fell dead to the floor with bullet holes in their uniforms, and Phillips and Bride ducked back behind the booths at the end of the car, the soldiers who were left shouting and firing at them. "Fuck!" Bride shouted, ejecting the emptied clip from his rifle and sliding a fresh one he grabbed at the town into the gun. He stood up and fired at a soldier who had been creeping up the center aisle towards where he and Phillips were taking cover. The bullet struck the Nazi soldier in the face, and he was flung backwards into another soldier. Phillips stood up and shouted, "Fuck that guy, and fuck you too!" He fired a shot at the startled soldier who was still holding their dead comrade. A few more bullets went flying through the air, and then all the soldiers who had been in the car lay dead on the floor. With the Germans in the car all dead, Phillips and Bride ran out of their hiding place and ran over to the other end of the car. They opened the door but found the car ahead was a cargo car with no door to the inside. "We'll have to go onto the roof again," Bride said. "That was short-lived." Phillips nodded. "I think some of the cargo cars do have doors, though." "Well, this one doesn't," Bride said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and stepping over the coupler. He climbed up the ladder on the end of the next car and up onto its roof. Phillips followed him. As they got up onto the roof and crouched, preparing to run for the next car, they heard distant shouting echoing from somewhere ahead. "Think they heard the shots?" Bride asked. Phillips reloaded his rifle with a clip Bride handed him. "How could they not have?" he asked, throwing the spent one off to the side and sliding the new one in. He stood up and Bride followed suit. "Let's go," Phillips said. They took off at a run across the roof. When they got to the end of the car and saw the next one had no door on the end, they jumped across the gap to the next car. They were halfway across the roof of this car when Bride grabbed Phillips by the shoulder. "Look!" he said, pointing. On the next car, another passenger car, soldiers were climbing up onto the roof. "Damn it," Phillips said with gritted teeth, unslinging his rifle and firing at the nearest soldier. The bullet struck his hand as he was pulling himself up onto the roof at the end of the car closer to the sailors, and he yelped, falling down into the open gap between the cars. Bride also unslung his weapon and aimed it, fired, and struck one of the soldiers on the next car in the chest. He gasped, fell to his knees, and slid off the side of the car, flopping onto the ground, looking kind of like the rag dolls Bride's little cousin played with. He and Phillips kept firing as the Nazis climbed up onto the roof, each of their shots hitting true. Adrenaline was a hell of a thing. They didn't let up or give the soldiers time to get ready to fire back. "It's not U-boats, but I hope you're keeping count. You might owe me a drink yet," Phillips said once the next car was clear. and he and Bride ran to the end of their car, climbed down, and entered the empty passenger car. They paused. The cargo cars all must have been stuffed full of stolen art, as full as they could be, because this car had been stuffed with artifacts as well, leaving only a few tables open for the soldiers to sit at. Slightly shocked at actually seeing some of the stolen artifacts, Phillips and Bride slowly walked up the aisle, looking at the pieces. Paintings, statues, and other artifacts all had been stuffed into the car. Bride slung his rifle and grabbed a painting. "This is a Van Gogh piece," he said, showing Phillips. "Yeah," Phillips murmured, taking a few steps further down the aisle. He passed Greek statues, framed pencil sketches, paintings by famous artists from the previous centuries, weapons that looked like they were made by the Romans. But something more modern laying on a table in one booth caught his eye. He picked up a document off the table and showed Bride. "Don't suppose you can read it?" Bride set the painting down and shook his head, but took the paper and scanned it anyway. The lights in the car were a dim yellow, but they gave enough of a glow off to make the letters on the paper out. Bride looked back up. One word here and there, but the word Wunderwaffe is on here. Wonder weapon. William, they're not just transporting art on this train. At the very least, they're also transporting plans for secret weapons. Maybe even some prototypes. It's a cache of everything they want to keep hidden, Phillips realized. Bride nodded. At least, everything they were able to get loaded on here. Maybe some of it never made it here, but look at everything that did. I wonder if these wonder weapons are what Aaronmore was really interested in acquiring off the off chance that we actually pulled this off, Phillips muttered. The wall at the opposite end of the car suddenly exploded and huge bullets flew into the car. Multiple ancient statues were shattered, paintings were shredded, and artifacts exploded into pieces. "Shit, go!" Phillips shouted. He and Bride had ducked down on the floor when it started and now crouch-walked back to the door they entered through. Exploded, splintered fragments of artifacts raining down on them the whole way. And they hesitantly climbed up the ladder onto the roof of the car to see what was going on. Peeking across the roof, they saw the next car was neither a cargo or passenger car. It was the armored car topped off with a massive double-barreled anti-aircraft gun that was firing shot after shot into the car Phillips and Bride had just been inside of. The gunner didn't seem to care if he destroyed the art or not. He was just hell-bent on eliminating the American cowboys who had boarded their train. "We can't just rush that. That guy will see us, aim that big gun our way, and blow us away," Phillips said. "We'll climb around the outside, cling to the roof, and use the window frames like stepping stones to pull yourself along." "Oh, great," Bride mumbled. "See you on the other side," Phillips said, climbing down the ladder and going to the left side of the car, climbing out of sight. "The other side of the train car, I hope," Bride said, but did the same. He pulled himself onto the right side of the car and began pulling himself along, stepping on the window frames as he went. The man operating the anti-aircraft gun hadn't stopped firing. It seemed like he wasn't going to until he reduced everything inside to dust. As Bride pulled himself along, a tree branch snapped past. He suddenly realized how dangerous his position was and pulled himself along faster. The last thing he needed was to be hit by a tree branch or a sign along the railroad. Bride quickly reached the end of the car and looked around the edge at the man. Deciding it would be too awkward to unsling his rifle and shoot from the angle while hanging onto the side of the train, he pulled out his pistol from its holster. He fired at the soldier, and they fell backwards. The big gun stopped firing as soon as he was flung back. Bride pulled himself around to the front of the train car and saw Phillips doing the same. He also had his pistol out. He laughed. "I think we fired at the same time." Bride nodded, holstering the weapon. They kept moving, climbing over the armored car, and from the top, they could now see the engine ahead in the darkness. Between it and the two sailors was another cargo car, then another passenger car, then 3 or 4 more cargo cars after that. "Nearly there," Phillips said. They crossed to the next cargo car and pulled themselves up the ladder. As they got to the top, they stopped. Standing at the opposite end of the car's roof was a Nazi colonel. In all likelihood, this was the commander of the train operation, the man who would oversee what happened to it, and it seemed he had come to deal with the American wannabe cowboys himself. The scene even almost looked like the big stare-down scene in a Western. The colonel's cap blew off from the wind. A sudden gust occurred as the train shifted slightly. Phillips and Bride realized they were pulling away from the main track. "We've merged onto the secret one," Phillips said urgently, raising his rifle. The colonel did the same with his own weapon, a pistol, and fired first. His bullet struck Bride in the shoulder. Bride screamed, losing his footing and falling onto the roof. Phillips fired, but his shot was wild and missed. The colonel aimed his pistol towards him, so Phillips yelled and threw the rifle. It spun through the air and its butt struck the colonel in the face. He stumbled, firing a bullet into the roof as Phillips pulled his pistol out and fired several shots. The colonel ducked down and began firing back. Phillips felt the bullet graze his leg and he stumbled but didn't fall. He aimed his next shot and squeezed the trigger, but the gun was empty. The colonel attempted to fire his gun, but his gun also clicked. Phillips swore as the colonel snarled and rushed them. "Take the rifle! I can't shoot it with my shoulder out of commission!" Bride shouted, pulling his rifle over his shoulder and pushing it towards Phillips. Phillips grabbed it, but before he could aim, the colonel tackled him. He grabbed the rifle and pushed it down on Phillips's neck, pushing as hard as he could. Phillips felt his neck getting crushed, but he couldn't push the colonel away. Phillips was seeing stars when Bride was suddenly there, just like he had been on the YP-73, over the colonel's shoulder. He delivered a strong right hook into the colonel's ear. The man yelled and whipped around and tackled Bride. He lost the rifle in the struggle, and it slid over the side and was lost. Bride tried to get his pistol out, but the colonel kicked it from Bride's hand and it skidded down towards the other end of the car. Phillips coughed, still gasping for air, but when he saw the colonel getting Bride into a chokehold, he snarled. Bride was right. He wasn't going to let his friend down. Phillips crawled on all fours past the scuffle and grabbed the pistol. Sitting, he turned around and aimed the gun towards the fight. The colonel was tightening his grasp on Bride's neck. Even in the dim light, Phillips could see Bride was turning purple as he tried to get free, but he couldn't escape the chokehold he was being held in. One twist and the colonel would no doubt break his neck if he didn't just choke him to death. Phillips wasn't going to turn away, though, and keep going for the engine, even though it was a near impossible shot that he had only seconds to pull off. From the angle he was firing at, he had to shoot past Bride's head to hit the colonel. This was the moment he'd prove to himself what kind of man he really was, and he wouldn't waste it. He aimed. The wind was making holding his arm steady impossible, as was the shakiness that was creeping in again, and the nighttime light made getting a clear view of the shot impossible as well. He saw the colonel tightening his grasp on Bride's neck. Phillips steadied his aim, squeezed the trigger, and fired. The shot was nearly impossible even in good conditions. Phillips had only a tiny, narrow, open window to hit the colonel over Bride's shoulder. But the bullet struck true. It ripped into the colonel's head, punching into his skull above his left eye, and he fell back onto the train car's roof. Bride gasped for air as the man's grip on his neck slackened and he pulled himself away, coughing. Phillips dropped the pistol, it slid off the side of the train car and went tumbling into the darkness, and crawled forward, reaching his friend as he gasped for air. "Are you okay?" Phillips asked over the roar of the wind. Bride wheezed but nodded. "Give me a moment," he said, spitting out a glob of blood from his mouth. He didn't seem to have the strength to pull himself back to his feet. He did finally sit back on his knees and looked at Phillips. "Thank you." Phillips nodded, knowing there was nothing else to say. He stood up, looking over his shoulder towards the engine. "How much longer do we have before we get to the mountains?" Bride asked, still wheezing slightly. Phillips shook his head. "I don't know. I can't see them in the dark. The map made it look like it's miles, though." He grasped Bride's arm. "Come on, we have to go," he urged. As Bride climbed to his feet, he shook his head. Do we even have weapons?" Phillips didn't respond for a moment. "We have knives. We'll make it work." Before Bride could say anything, they heard several voices shouting on the next car, and saw several Nazis climbing onto the roof and lining up, aiming their weapons. It was a makeshift firing squad, and Phillips and Bride were standing in the middle of the roof. They had no cover, nowhere to run. The Nazis lined up in a row and aimed. "Shit," Bride exclaimed, and having no other option, stood and shoved Phillips over the side as hard as he could as the soldiers fired. He and Phillips tumbled down to the hard ground, crashed into it, and rolled several times before they lost momentum and stopped. They both felt like their entire bodies were on fire from the pain of the impact, and they both had to refill their lungs with air after the fall knocked the wind out of them. They both eventually managed to sit up and watched the train cars roll by. After a few minutes, the last one passed, and the train was gone. Despite the pain they were both in, Phillips and Bride crawled forward to the tracks and looked down the line. They watched the last car vanishing into the distance, and soon it was lost to sight in the darkness. Just as the cause to stop the train was. It was a lost cause. It always had been. As they watched it fade from view in the distance, Bride had only one thing to say in response to watching the train rumble away into the night. Fuck what Aaron Moore wants. They were alive, despite everything that had happened, and they weren't going to kill themselves trying to chase it down again. Once the train was gone, save for the fading noise of its distant roar, they sat back next to the tracks and recovered for a few minutes. Phillips eventually spoke as he shakily got himself onto his feet once he was sure he could walk. "Come on, we have to go. We're still in hostile territory. There's no flare to shoot off to get us out of it this time." He held a hand out and Bride took it, and Phillips pulled him to his feet. Though it hurt, everything hurt. They unbuttoned their disguises and pulled the shirts off, followed by the pants. Leaving them on the tracks, now wearing their own uniforms again, they set off away from the tracks into the forest, supporting each other as they walked in case the other's legs gave out. Bride was limping on a hurt leg. They cut through the woods towards where they knew a road would be, according to their now lost map anyway. All they had left if they needed to protect themselves were knives. Bride felt his legs give out suddenly, but he didn't fall. Phillips, whose arms were under his shoulders, pulled him back up to his feet. "Come on," Phillips encouraged, pulling Bride's arm over his shoulder. "Let's go," he said, supporting his friend despite the obvious pain and strain it put on him. They soon came out of the woods to another dirt road and collapsed in the middle of it. They couldn't go any further. Dense forest flanked the road on all sides. An owl hooted from somewhere nearby. They silently decided that they'd sit there and wait for the Allies, the Americans, British, Canadians, it didn't matter who, to catch up to them. The ever-present sound of explosions in the distance, drawing nearer, told them the Allies weren't far behind them. Every explosion sounded nearer than the last, and every explosion meant the war was just that much closer to being won. At one point, they even thought they heard a plane flying somewhere in the distance, maybe dropping an airborne division into new territory. By the time the sun was coming up and the sky to the east turned a misty gray and silvery blue mix, a convoy rolled over the hill to the east, and Phillips and Bride watched it draw nearer to them, coming along the road. A tank division, followed by numerous other vehicles and flanked by numerous American troops. Phillips and Bride stood and put their hands up to alleviate any chance of being mistaken for aggressors. The troops spotted them and ran forward. They quickly realized the two in the road were friendlies once they saw their uniforms. Seeing that they were also injured, two soldiers both hurried forward and helped Phillips and Bride walk back to the safety of the convoy, one shouting, "Medic!" That was all that was important at the moment, getting their fellow soldiers help. They could ask how two American soldiers found themselves way beyond the German-held line later. The tiny town the train had left from had been abandoned by the time the American forces arrived. It was secured by the advancing Allied forces without a struggle. Phillips and Bride noticed, though, when they were taken back there, that the train station had been burned to the ground, along with the map depicting the exact location of the secret rail line. A search for the train was being launched, with Phillips and Bride explaining where the secret line branched off from the main line. The track had already been completely, if hurriedly, ripped out by the time the American forces explored it, and they only found all manner of fake paths branching off from it further up, each heading up into the mountains. Each had been made to look the same as the other, with line having been laid and recently ripped out of all of them in the same haphazard manner. And up these paths were even more branches, and more up those. A tangled maze of fake rail lines with one real one hidden in its mist, all heading up into the same mountains. There was no evidence as to which one had been the line the train had gone up, left behind. They all looked the same. All traces of the train were gone. Without the map they had seen in the train station, neither Phillips or Bride felt confident they would be able to lead the American troops to the train's destination when asked if they knew which way it had gone after branching off the main line. The best they could do was point to the general area in the mountains where it had gone on the map they saw, and mention the area had possibly hundreds of old mine shafts the train could have entered. The medics who came to treat them looked shocked that the two sailors were even still standing when they saw them. There was hardly an inch of skin on their bodies that wasn't bruised, especially their backs and shoulders from the fall they had both taken off the train. Phillips and Bride were checked for broken bones, but they had none. The medics seemed surprised by this from how banged up they were. They were treated for what wounds they could be by the field medics, though. Several open, deep scratches on both of them were stitched up. The bullet that struck Bride's shoulder left an exit wound on the back of his shoulder, so it was easy to treat with the bullet not still being inside him. Phillips's gunshot wound was also easily treated, but they were told they needed more thorough care and a checkup back in the territory under complete control of the Allied forces. In the meantime, they spent the next several hours at the town, resting up. They were given food and water, and the medics had come to check on them a few times before they left with one of the companies for the next push. The sound of vehicles rolling through was ceaseless, as was the march of boots on the road, but it was also eventually joined by music. Someone had apparently found a record player in one of the buildings and was letting it play. An upbeat tune was sounding, almost mournfully, through the empty town. Phillips and Bride hoped that whoever lived there was not lying dead in the woods somewhere. Throughout the morning, they watched several divisions of tanks roll through, flanked by soldiers, and it really brought a feeling that the war was truly almost over. The sky was also filled with flocks of British planes. The Royal Air Force were taking over the skies held by the regime who'd been bombing them for years. It was a beautiful sight to see with a sunrise also accompanied by the first day of clear skies the two had seen since entering Poland. The overcast clouds had fully broken away for a gorgeous sunrise. It really did feel in that moment like the war was already won and that Europe was taken back from the Nazis. The train was gone, but the Nazis had lost. Maybe it'll end before we can get shipped back to Alaska, Phillips said at one point, putting out a cigarette a passing soldier had offered him. Bride chuckled. Maybe it'll end before Aaronmore can send us back to do some other batshit mission to die on. Phillips nodded. Yeah, fuck him and what he wants. They both laughed at that. Though their task was a total failure, they didn't care. They were alive. Unlike the other unfortunate people who had been forced to play Aaronmore's little games, they had survived. And Aaronmore had never truly wanted the train stopped. He wanted them dead. Him not getting his wish was enough for them. They wouldn't be the ones who had rumors of their strange deaths going around next. Besides, Europe is in such chaos right now. War might end before he even learns we're still alive, Bride said. Or before anyone has a moment to think about sending us back to the Alaskan Navy. No complaints there. I am over the cold weather, Phillips agreed. I'm over yippee boats, too. They were silent for a moment before Phillips added, Do you think he would? Aaronmore? He asked. Bride nodded. Hell yeah, the war's not over yet. Well, Phillips said, let's hope we never see him again. They sat together as the sun continued to rise higher in the sky, as planes flew overhead, as paratroops dropped from the sky like rain, as whole companies of soldiers marched past, as divisions of tanks rolled by. The war might not have been over yet, but after the night they'd had, it was still the most beautiful morning Phillips and Bride had ever seen. The train was gone, and with it so much knowledge, but light was returning to Europe nonetheless. The Second Dark Age was almost over.